Hello, my name is Michael Blue, and today I'm going to be talking about discrimination against pagans in public schools. Before we begin, we'll need to address a few things. The first is that to ensure you that this is not a biased study. I am not pagan, I never have been, although I have known and been friends with people who are. The second thing we'll need to do before we begin is to define what a pagan is. A pagan is somebody who follows an earth-based or nature-based religion. A few prominent religions that fit in this group are things like Wicca and Celticism, but it's a broad enough term that it could technically encompass anything that isn't Christian, Jewish, or Islamic. But for a lot of this presentation, I will be focusing on Wicca. The argument that I developed through my research and my study that I will be talking about today is that more often than not, pagans who attend public schools are discriminated against by both peers and faculty. Over the course of time, either through actually trying to force themselves into another religion or denying or suppressing that they are pagan, they lose a sense of self. They forget a part of their identity, and for some of these kids who actually belong to families that practice religion, it causes a lot of uh, turmoil in the personal life. I think I will be able to make this much more evident with the case study I'm about to go over. And as a result, some of these students, in order to fend off these other people, will either start suppressing or even denying the fact that they are a pagan. And in some cases, they may start to be Christian or pretend to be Christian to help defend against them. But before I do that, I want to clearly state the three main points I will be going over to support my thesis. First, I will be going over a case study I did with a former high school peer, Sarah, who was a Wiccan. Second, I will do a brief observation about the plethora of different types of blogs and tutorials for people who are pagan and have been suffering from different forms of discrimination and bullying. And finally, I will do an examination over a few articles about faculty who either ignored or changed or just outright did things that were illegal in a lot of senses to discriminate against these kids and sometimes their whole entire families. As a part of this courses project, I got a hold of and interviewed over phone on September 25th of this year, Sarah. She was a classmate of mine in high school, and she's Wiccan. As freshmen, me and Sarah belonged to the same group of friends. During that time, she was openly Wiccan with us and pretty much anyone who was willing to ask, and she often openly wore a pentagram necklace, which is the equivalent of the crucifix for Christians. She came from a Wiccan family. Her mother was openly Wiccan, uh, but she kind of receded in her worship a little bit after she met her father. Sarah's father was, for the most part, atheist and felt a little bit weird around all the worship, so they didn't really do it a lot at home, but she was still open about it. As a freshman, she was a pretty happy girl. She was really sarcastic, but in a good way. She had a decent group of friends. I'd probably say overall she had a pretty decent life, everything considered. Things took a turn for the worse for her sophomore year. She really excelled in English and art, so she started taking a lot of honors and AP classes. Unfortunately, her main group of friends didn't have the same kind of drive, so she found that the only time she really saw anyone in that main group was during lunch, if they happened to have the same lunch period. But other than that, every class she was in, she didn't know anybody. On the second day of one of these classes, a girl sitting next to her, whom she didn't know, asked her about the necklace she was wearing, which was her pentagram necklace. And she explained to the girl that she was Wiccan, and when the girl asked what Wiccan was, she said that she was a witch. Saying you're a witch in Wicca is pretty much the equivalent of a Christian saying they're Christian instead of saying I'm a believer of Christ. And instead of giving Sarah a chance to explain, this girl immediately turned to another girl sitting next to her and started gossiping. The girl was so loud about it that the teacher eventually overheard it and stopped class to find out what was so important that it had to be talked about in the middle of the introduction to the course. And the girl responded very loudly that Sarah said she was a witch. The teacher, thinking Sarah was just trying to do something to be rude or dismissive, just blew it off and told Sarah to come talk to her after class. Unfortunately, this is where the grit of the bad stuff started happening for Sarah. She waited in class for all the students to leave and went up to the teacher to talk to her. And the teacher came off with the normal, why are you doing this? It's childish, etc., etc. But Sarah went on to explain to her, like, I wasn't just trying to scare her and try to think I was going to cast spells on her or anything. It's just, I'm Wiccan, I'm a witch, that's my religion. Unfortunately, this is where the grit of the bad stuff started happening for Sarah. She waited in class for all the students to leave and went up to the teacher to talk to her. And the teacher came off with the normal, why are you doing this? It's childish, etc., etc. But Sarah went on to explain to her, like, I wasn't just trying to scare her and try to think I was going to cast spells on her or anything. It's just, I'm Wiccan, I'm a witch, that's my religion. Unfortunately, this is where the grit of the bad stuff started happening for Sarah. She waited in class for all the students to leave and went up to the teacher to talk to her. And the teacher came off with the normal, why are you doing this? It's childish, etc., etc. But Sarah went on to explain to her, like, I wasn't just trying to scare her and try to think I was going to cast spells on her or anything. It's just, I'm Wiccan, I'm a witch, that's my religion. The teacher, being of a Christian demeanor, was very offended by this and immediately began to barrage Sarah, saying she was going to go to hell and that she was worthless and that she needed to get saved and a whole lot of other very hurtful things. When Sarah tried to talk back, the teacher just kept cutting her off and cutting her off. And the debate, the teacher concluded with, I don't care what religion you are. It's not a real religion. You don't bring it up in class. Period. As far as I'm concerned, it doesn't exist. You don't talk, blah, blah, blah. Really belittled her, and it just left her really drained and frustrated. So instead of going to her next class, she went to the principal. And unfortunately, he wasn't very much help either. When Sarah tried to explain to him what had happened, he took the same stance the teacher had took initially, that Sarah was just saying things to try to scare or push away this other girl and that she was making it up. And the more Sarah tried to explain to him that it wasn't just her trying to be scary or cool or anything, that it was a real part of her life and her identity, he just basically summed it up as, you're into the occult and you're trying to bring it into the school. And in the end, just basically said, if it's not a religion, you're not protected in any way. Don't bring it into school. The cult doesn't belong here. Then later, when Sarah got home, she tried to ask her parents for help, knowing that really neither teacher had any legal grounds for treating her the way they did. But unfortunately, Sarah's dad, being kind of spooked about the whole situation, didn't want to get involved and didn't want to make a scene, and basically told her, you know, you can still be Wiccan without wearing a pentagram and telling everyone. Just keep it quiet and to yourself and just ride out the semester. Unfortunately, her peers didn't want to take the same route. She found that from then on, the girl and all their immediate friends, and quickly a lot of other students she didn't even know, were coming up to her saying very rude, insulting things like, when's the last time you sacrificed a cat? Or how many orgies have you been in lately? Because a lot of people stereotypically like to clump Wiccans with Satanists and occultists, even though there really is a difference, and there's no part of Wicca that involves any sort of really violent, gruesome, hedonistic things like that. Also, around this time, our group of friends started noticing she wasn't wearing her pentagram and she was being distant from us. And then later on, she also started bringing a Bible to school. And when we tried to talk to her about it, she basically ignored us, tried to act like we didn't exist. And really, as the sophomore year ended, she just sort of became a really withdrawn super Christian that wouldn't talk to anybody. Later, when I interviewed her, I tried to get her to explain to me why it is she reacted the way she did, or how she felt about the whole situation, and like really give an emotional perspective on the whole thing. She explained that, sort of to defend herself, she started distancing herself from everybody, and she stopped wearing the pentagram and started carrying the Bible, just to sort of put off the image of not being pagan, in hopes of keeping the bullies away and keeping the teachers out of her hair, because there were other teachers who tried to suppress her openly saying things and expressing things because they felt it was more disruptive, even if it meant just a student seeing her pentagram and inquiring about it. And over time, from just gradually putting on this face, she grew into it and kind of forgot who she was. And it wasn't until about a year after she graduated and met a guy who happened to be Wiccan that she really got back into touch with that part of herself, and had a bit of a emotional breakdown, and she was just glad she was past that point in her life. But the whole conversation was just really not fun for me. I ended up actually ending it early because she started crying as she talked about meeting the guy and reconnecting with herself, and really the whole situation, idea, concept. It was just a whole bad thing. So naturally, I can't just tell you this sad story, move on. We have to take a step back and examine it, and I'm going to do so with the interpretive approach. From this particular situation, we can make a few observations. The first one I would like to point out is the fact that so many people didn't know what Wiccan was, and just because of Sarah's choice to use the word witch instead of Wiccan, immediately began to clump her with a bunch of negative things, which therefore shows that, in general, a typical high school student or sometimes teacher will not see any difference between a Wiccan or an occultist or a Satanist. They will try to clump them together in some way or form. Second, in the case of Christians, because Sarah did talk about more situations than I described, but more often than not, when a Christian finds out that a person is of a pagan religion, they become angry and feel a need to force this person into Christianity in some way, either out of fear of being affiliated with them or out of a misplaced sense of sympathy. The final observation is that um, even though Wicca is a religion that is recognized by the U.S. Congress, it doesn't help stop the fact that in more cases than Sarah's, there have been Wiccans who have been discriminated against or just outright not protected in a public school setting. The next piece of evidence I'd like to use in support of my thesis is just the large amount of user-made blogs, forums, and tutorials about what it's like and how to cope with being a pagan in a school environment where you're being bullied or discriminated against. While I know technically in this sort of setting I can't directly reference, say, a blog or a forum if it isn't made by a accredited person or agency or have references to one of those things, I can draw from the fact that it would be impossible for one person to sit down and lie and make this amount of content. It shows that Sarah's case was not unique and is not unique. That there are many, many students in public schools who are being discriminated and bullied against because they are pagan, enough so that people are trying to come up with ways and groups to help support those who are actually doing it. Another thing I have found just by reading through several forums is that another reason a lot of these kids get picked on isn't just because they're of a religion that isn't really respected openly in American society, is also the fact that they are such a minority. It is not uncommon for some of these kids or families to be 1 in 10,000 who actually feel or follow the same religion. Another thing I have found just by reading through several forums is that another reason a lot of these kids get picked on isn't just because they're of a religion that isn't really respected openly in American society, is also the fact that they are such a minority. it is not uncommon for some of these kids or families to be 1 in 10,000 who actually feel or follow the same religion. And because of this, the nearest support might literally be a few hundred miles away. So, really being able to fight against, not physically, but just defend against all this discrimination and aggression becomes very difficult because the person finds that they are on their own. And I also think this is part of what leads to these kids, and in Sarah's case, um, just dropping their religion altogether, feeling that the pain that they feel as a result of having a religion openly really just counter every good benefit they had from just finding something to believe in. Which sort of leads to my next main point, which is how a lot of these students aren't getting the support they deserve, and how just the culture and the environment of the school isn't helping with that, even though there are laws that attempt to do it. As you all may know, the Constitution has a clause in it that defines freedom of religion, which basically says anyone can have any religion anywhere they want so long as it does not impede on someone else's religion. Unfortunately, this clause isn't always enough to protect someone who isn't of a religion that's the majority in a certain area. The first piece of evidence I want to use to support this is an article I found on foxnews.com, originally wrote on May 3rd of 2007. This article shows a classic situation where a faculty member does not recognize the rights of a Wiccan the same way he does a Christian. The story follows where a pagan family has a 16-year-old daughter who is at a local high school. As one of the holidays, it is traditional for the children to draw pentagrams on their faces as part of a celebration. And this holiday on this part of the year just happened to fall on a school day. Well, one of the teachers wasn't happy about her showing up like that and didn't recognize it as a right of hers being a religious holiday and sent her to the principal, who ended up sending her home. The father of the family, not seeing any reason for them to be able to do that, let her go to school the next day, but as a sort of come and get me if you want to kind of thing, as a taunt, she came with even more drawn on her face than the previous day. The defense that the superintendent of the school gave the situation was stating that if, say, a Christian student was to come in with crucifixes drawn over their face and it was a distraction, it would be within the school's rights to send them home or make them remove it, unless if it's part of a specific tradition. The discrimination comes in because he refused to accept that it is a normal pagan tradition in this particular part of the religion to draw pentagrams on yourself at the same time every year, but he didn't want to recognize this and stood by the principal's choice of suspending the girl. The defense that the superintendent of the school gave the situation was stating that if, say, a Christian student was to come in with crucifixes drawn over their face and it was a distraction, it would be within the school's rights to send them home or make them remove it, unless if it's part of a specific tradition. The discrimination comes in because he refused to accept that it is a normal pagan tradition in this particular part of the religion to draw pentagrams on yourself at the same time every year, but he didn't want to recognize this and stood by the principal's choice of suspending the girl. This shows a situation where the Christian man did not view the pagans as having the same uh, level of respectability as he did. He did not want to acknowledge that these traditions had as same amount of rights as, say, a Christian having ash on their forehead on Ash Wednesday. The next piece of evidence I would like to use, even though it's not directly pertinent to pagans in general, it does fall under the same category of religious discrimination, is a article written in August of this year from Politics USA, which is about a law recently passed in Missouri which would allow Christians to more forcibly um, teach Bible related things in school. Normally, under the First Amendment, if a school wanted to teach about the Bible, they would need to do it in a strictly um, writing context sense. So, for instance, the way the Bible is written, it could be used as a way of trying to teach a form of poetry, but you couldn't do it just for the fact of making sure the children or teenagers knew about what was in the Bible. Unfortunately, the law that Missouri just passed technically contradicts this in saying that if there is something in the Bible the community thinks the people should know, they can force it to be taught in the schools. So even though this doesn't directly relate to pagans, it does affect any pagan living in that state. So, for instance, if there's a pagan family that has a student in public school, they now have to deal with the fact that they're being forced to learn something about a different religion, which is ethically questionable. So, hopefully, from these two articles, we can draw that even though there are legal outlines about what is and isn't okay for a school to do and what they are obligated to do, in many cases they just outright don't do it or ignore it or interpret it in a way that is more beneficial for the non pagan. So, in conclusion, I'd like to state that there's a lot of confusion in American public schools about what is and isn't right when it comes to pagan religions. And as a result, many teen and child pagans find themselves bullied and discriminated against, and as a result, have their identity damaged and their culture sort of taken away from them to an extent. Part of this stems from just outright ignorance of what pagan religions are, which is understandable in the context that it's a very small group of people, but it still exists, and even if it isn't a religion you've heard of, it's still ethically wrong to treat them differently just because of it. But regardless, there are cases where teachers and students have treated these pagans badly in many, many ways, and nothing's done about it in a lot of cases, even though there are laws set up to try to protect them. But regardless, there are cases where teachers and students have treated these pagans badly in many, many ways, and nothing's done about it in a lot of cases, even though there are laws set up to try to protect them. Hopefully, by hearing this, you might think of a situation where you have seen this happen or know where it might be happening and at least attempt to console the person going through it and try to help people around them understand why it isn't right to treat them differently. That it's just not some childish superstition, that it's actually part of a person's life. It's not really right in any way. So, thank you for listening.